Good evening. It's great to be here. We got a little bit of rain a few minutes ago. It doesn't look like it persisted very much, but I know we're all thankful to get a little bit of rain. Maybe that'll cool things off a little bit. It's great to be here. It's great to have an opportunity to worship God, sing His praises, be able to go to Him in prayer. It's always a great time. And specifically, y'all know that I get extremely excited whenever we start a new sermon series and whenever we finish up one, because it's a new study we're getting to embark on and getting to find some new information. So I'm excited about this. I'm excited about studying the book of 1 Timothy. It's a great book to find out how church ought to be, how God wants His bride to be. Because that's essentially what Paul was writing to Timothy for, to show him the way things should be conducted and how people should be acting and how the family as a whole ought to be acting. This morning we did an introduction. We looked at an introduction specifically to who Paul and Timothy were and a little bit about them at the time when this was written. We looked specifically at the place where Timothy was when Paul wrote this letter to him, to Ephesus, and a little bit about Paul's dealings in the past with that city and some of the struggle that we had there. And we also looked at an introduction to the letter. And in the introduction to the letter, we kind of touched on the foundation that's going to be laid for the rest of this entire letter. Why particularly Paul felt necessary to write this letter. Now, it's not going to be the only reason, and we're going to see later that there was a particular point and purpose for this letter outside of just the things that were going on, the teachers that would be coming and causing problems. But that is a very big part of why. We're going to actually do a little bit of backtracking this evening. This morning we looked at chapter 1, verses 1 all the way down to verse 4, I believe. We're going to back up to verse 3 for tonight's lesson and go back over that. If you will, go ahead and turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 1. We're going to read verses 3 through 11 and then down at verses 18 to 20. We'll pick up 12 through 17 next week. But this really deals with what Paul's charge to Timothy was. The title of this evening's lesson is A Father's Charge, because as we discovered this morning, Paul looks to Timothy as his son in the faith, someone he has a very endearing relationship with. It was part of Paul's regular system to find somebody in particular that he would try to have an impact on, that he would try to motivate. And that specific person he would take along with him. He actually took several people at a time. And he would try to train them to do what he does. And we also looked at a little bit how Paul urged this to be the pattern. He told Timothy in 2 Timothy to also be looking for the same thing. To take those very same things that he had heard Paul say in the presence of many witnesses and entrust those to faithful men who would be able to teach others also. We've looked at that before and talked about how that's a 4-generation plan. You have Paul saying things before many witnesses, teaching that to Timothy, and then commanding Timothy to take those very same things and tell them to people who will tell them to people. So this pattern is one that's going to be essential, because Paul does not intend, God does not intend for us to take Christianity and just sit on it and to not do anything with it. He doesn't intend for us to just keep it with us. Christianity is a message that's supposed to be shared. It's good news. We've done a lot of looking into good news recently. We just got finished with the series on the stories that changed the world, the parables that Jesus told. And most of them center around this good news and how it affects the world and how it impacts the world. So as we're looking this evening into the Father's charge, Paul's charge to Timothy, let's bear in mind that importance and the importance of the gospel being shared. If you will read with me there, 1 Timothy chapter 1, beginning in verse 3. As I urged you when I was going to Macedonia, remain at Ephesus, that you may charge certain persons not to teach any different doctrine, nor to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies, which promote speculations rather than stewardship from God that is by faith. The aim of our charge is love that issues from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. Certain persons, by swerving from these, have wandered away into vain discussion, desiring to be teachers of the law without understanding either what they are saying or the things about which they make confident assertions. Now we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, and for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine, in accordance with the glorious gospel of the blessed God with which I have been entrusted. Now let's skip down and look at verse 18, if you will. This charge I entrust to you, Timothy, my child, in accordance with the prophecies previously made about you, that by them you may wage the good warfare, holding faith and a good conscience. By rejecting this, some have made shipwreck of their faith, among whom are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have handed over to Satan, that they may learn not to blaspheme. Before we go on, let me make it clear why there was a little gap in our reading. Paul has a way of, during his letters, during his speeches, sometimes going off on a tangent. And that's not a negative thing or a bad thing. Specifically here, it's a good thing. As he is talking about this sinfulness that plagues the humanity and that causes a rift between God and man, he recalls his own self and his own sinfulness and what God has done through him. And that's going to be the topic of next Sunday morning's lesson. But in this evening's lesson, we wanted to focus on what this charge was that Paul gave to Timothy. What he wanted Timothy to know. What he wanted Timothy to do. And as we looked at this morning, Paul had already urged Timothy to stay in Ephesus when he was going to go on over to Macedonia, had urged him to stay in Ephesus and stay there so that he could charge people. So this was something that Paul wanted, and it was something that he felt very compelled to compel Timothy to do. But this evening, we're going to be looking at three distinct aspects of this charge. First, a reason to charge. Why specifically Paul would need to charge someone to do this. Now, there's two aspects of this. First, the why to charge instead of to just ask. And the second part, what we're really going to be focusing in on, is the point behind it, what's hoping to get accomplished. The second thing we're going to look at this evening is what we know, and specifically what Paul said there that they knew, dealing specifically about the law. And the third and final thing we're going to be looking at this evening is waging the good warfare. That's what Paul urged Timothy to do, to wage the good warfare. And he had given him the tools to do so. The things he needed to do that will be one of the things that we look at. But first, back to this initial point. A reason to charge. For Paul to be able to tell Timothy, do this, he needed to have a reason for it. Just saying, do this, isn't quite enough. The reason I say that is that Paul, while he was an apostle, was still a man. And while Paul did get directions from God on how to accomplish certain things and what to do, he was still a man. If Paul was to come to me and tell me, this is the way it is, he would need to prove that to me in some way. That was the purpose for the spiritual gifts, and that was the purpose for them backing up what they said by Scriptures. You may recall when we studied in Galatians chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, Paul was very clear that if somebody came and said anything contrary to the doctrine which they had originally taught, they ought to be accursed, even if it was emperor or an angel from heaven. Anybody. The reason the Bereans were more noble than those in Thessalonica, more noble than the Jews in Thessalonica, was because they searched the Scriptures to see if what Paul was saying was true. So that's not a negative thing at all. But the reason for the charge extending beyond that, the purpose, the point of the matter, the end result desired, is something that is often lost in the battle. The desired end result of this charge was love. Love that issued from a pure heart, a conscience that is good, and a faith that is sincere. When Paul said in verse 5, the aim of our charge, we might think about how someone aims when they're trying to make a shot, whether with a bow and arrow or rifle or something like that, or maybe when they're aiming, playing horseshoes. But that's not really the full extent of the word. The word there literally means what your goal is to have accomplished. The things that you want to get finished at the end. When you're done, you want it to look like this. That's really the full extent of the word. So what was the full extent of what they wanted accomplished by this charge? He wanted for there to be love. God wanted there to be love. What kind of love? Any kind of love? Love that issued from the heart. From a pure heart. A heart that is spotless, clean, free of anything that would make it negative, bad before God. A conscience that is good. Now that word conscience there deals specifically with morality and having a good moral compass, being able to distinguish between right and wrong. And the adjective that is used to describe that moral compass, that conscience, is good. Now, good may not have a really big meaning for us. We say it a lot. This is good. That was good. That would be good. That's fine. That's good. But good was something that a Jew was very familiar with. If something was called good, it was a deeper meaning. In fact, that was the Hebrew greeting, Boker Tov. It meant good day. They weren't just saying hello. They were hoping that their day was filled with good things, blessings from God. And that's really the whole attitude behind this. A conscience that is good and a faith that is sincere. I'm sure we have all met someone before who is someone who does something, maybe something nice for someone else, but they may not do it sincerely. Perhaps they have a particular motivation. Maybe it's something they want to get out of it. Maybe they have a reason for being kind or nice or doing something for someone else. Maybe someone else has something they want. Maybe they want to be seen by others, whatever it might be. A faith that is sincere. A faith that's not based on wanting to have outward appearances seem sincere. A faith that's not based on hollow emptiness, but just looks good on the outside, something that was plaguing the Jews at the time of Jesus. When he came looking at them, he found them to be whitewashed walls, as he described them. In fact, in one place he calls them whitewashed tombs that outwardly look nice, but inwardly they're filled with dead men's bones. They weren't good on the inside. They were very bad on the inside, no matter how they appeared on the outside. So what's the end result? That end result, that end goal, was for there to be a good moral compass, love that issues from a pure heart, and for there to be a sincere faith cultivated. That sounds pretty basic. In fact, if you could boil down Christianity, that would be a pretty good description of what Christianity's goal is. Love from a pure heart, a conscience that is good, and a faith that is sincere. Yet, certain persons, some people had swerved from that, deviated, changed course. These individuals had went a different way. And it was not just causing them a problem. They found themselves somewhere where they did not initially mean to be. Because they deviated from the standard of teaching, because they were teaching a different doctrine, they found themselves dislocated. It's interesting the wording that Paul uses here. Because while the aim of his charge that Timothy was to be charging others with, while it was the goal here, that's not where the people found themselves. Some individuals, when their goals should have been here, when their end results should have been here, found themselves somewhere way far out in the other field. How had they gotten to this other place? Paul told Timothy, certain persons had swerved away and wandered into vain discussion. Vain's not a word we use very much anymore. We're probably all familiar with what it means, but a more common way of speaking that we might put it is they were using pointless, unproductive discussion that it wasn't accomplishing anything. They were talking about things that didn't really matter. Back in verse 4, remember Paul had told Timothy to charge them not to devote themselves to myths or endless genealogies, which promote speculation rather than stewardship from God that is by faith. That was one of the things we studied this morning. That some of these people were focusing on these genealogies, these myths, and that was causing them to teach things that weren't important and that actually deviated from doctrine, the pattern of things that had been taught. These individuals were causing a lot of problems. And it's important to recognize that the problems they were causing was not just themselves. The first thing that Paul pointed out to Timothy was these individuals had dislocated themselves, had not ended up where they should have ended up. That while the aim of the charge was for there to be a pure heart, a loving, pure heart, and a good conscience and a sincere faith, these people didn't have that. They found themselves somewhere else. And because of that, what were they doing to the people around them? They were causing problems with them as well. They were dislocating them, causing others to swerve from the truth, causing others to swerve from that aim, that end result, that final goal. It's similar to what Jesus taught, that the lessons that the Pharisees were teaching were like leaven, and that a little leaven would leaven the whole lump. In fact, Jesus instructed his disciples to beware the leaven of the Pharisees. To beware it. Why? Because it spreads, and it'll cause problems elsewhere. These individuals are described in verse 7 as desiring to be teachers of the law. Now, this is a word that is used in the Gospels as well. Jesus used it to describe a particular people. And these people were those that taught the law. When he is listing Pharisees, scribes, the lawyers, he lists those that were teachers of the law. It seems to be pretty self-explanatory. They wanted to be the people that taught others. Yet they didn't understand neither what they were speaking themselves, nor what they were making confident assertions about. These people didn't have an understanding. It means that word there, understanding, literally means that they did not comprehend. Possibly because they had had no training, possibly because they had not looked into it, possibly because they had not applied any due diligence and study. Whatever it might have been, they didn't understand it. Not only were they teaching others and speaking about it, but they were making confident assertions. It means they were saying, this is the way it is. They were boldly saying, this is truth. And they didn't know what they were talking about. It's kind of interesting. This is a similar thing to what Jesus had to deal with. While they seem to be different beliefs, but a similar problem of not necessarily knowing what you're talking about. Wasn't that Jesus' response to many times? Have you not read? Have you not read? Jesus finds himself dealing with a people that know the law and can quote most of it to you, if not all of it. Yet they did not understand it. They were not applying it. They were misreading it. And these individuals desired to be teachers of the law, but they didn't understand this. They weren't able to give anything productive to those that were listening to them. In fact, what they were giving was unproductive. That's a pretty good reason for Paul to charge Timothy to talk to them, to answer them, to teach people to stick to the aim, stick to the goal. But then he goes on into something else. Paul says that there are certain things that we know. He said in verse 8 there that we know that the law is good. There's that word good again. The law is good. Well, that's interesting. After all, when Jesus came, he did abolish the law. Ephesians states that pretty clearly, that he took the law and abolished it in all of his ordinances, the written commandments, that pattern for worship. He abolished it. One of the points that Paul makes in the book of Romans is the law wasn't bad. The problem with the law was that we had to keep it, not that it was bad. If there was any law that could be given that would provide justification by works, it would be the law. But unfortunately, the fault was with us. We dwell in flesh. We make mistakes. We fail. The law is good. Notice he qualifies it there. If one uses it lawfully. It's interesting that the word for law in Greek is nomos. And the reason I tell you that is because he uses a play on the words here. The law is good if you use it lawfully. Lawfully comes from that same root word. Our English plays on it similarly. If you use the law the way the law defines you to use it, then it's good. If you use the law as it instructs you to. If I am being lawful, that means I'm abiding by what? The law. It's kind of self-explanatory there, yet it's profound. We are told how to properly live. And if we live by it, then we would be living properly. There's not anyone that can't understand that. Yet, there's something deeper that Paul goes into here. Understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just. The law is not laid down for the righteous person. The law is not laid down for the person that is not transgressing the law. Why is the law laid down? Well, Paul said that the law is laid down for the lawless. Now, the reason I told you that word for a law a minute ago is because that same word, the root word there, is brought up again. In fact, there's only one letter difference. And it means someone who is not under the law. Not because God exempted them, but because they chose to get outside of it. We have a phrase for this as well. Someone who is an outlaw. Someone who decides to step out of those bounds. The law is not there for people who abide the law. The law is there for those that step out from under it. It's not there for the righteous, the just. It's there for the unrighteous. He then goes on to give a list of people that the law is specifically for. For the lawless and disobedient. For the ungodly. Now, interestingly here, this word could be literally translated, the person who's anti-God. If you were to walk up to someone and say, God, they'd say, what? If you were to walk up and say, I went to church the other day, I don't care, I don't want to hear about it. If you walked up to this person and invited him to church, say, I'm not interested. This is a person that is anti-God. Not just that they are not interested in it itself, but they are so opposed to anything God. If you could think of the furthest person from being a Christian, not because of their works, but because of their attitude, that would be what this word here is trying to describe. The ungodly and the sinners. Literally here, a man who sins. A man who is missed the mark. That's what sin literally is described as. Sin is literally described as missing the mark. Such as if I was in archery and I had someone set an apple out there on a stump and I line up my bow and arrow and I stretch it out and shoot and miss my mark. That's what sin is. That'd be the easiest way to describe it, and that's the most literal way to describe it. But then he goes on. the unholy and profane, for those who strike fathers and mothers. Now, interesting here, the word for someone who strikes father and mother is the word for someone who commits patricide, killing their father, and the word to describe someone who kills their mother. It's also used to describe someone who strikes them, but the fullest extent of the word and the meaning of it is someone who murders. It's interesting seeing how God views hate. He said, if you hate your brother, you're as good as already have murdered him in your heart. The only thing you're lacking is opportunity. Well, here, after listing those that are very worldly, that it's pointless to try, that's what that word profane means, that it's just not even worth trying because they're so worldly. After listing that, he says, those who strike their fathers, those who are father murderers, those who strike their mothers, who are mother murderers. And then he just lays it all out as a blanket. Those who are murderers. These are the people who the law is for. Then he goes on to mention those who are sexually immoral. Now the word here is literally describing someone who perverts sexuality. The reason I word it that way because God did not create sex as a bad thing. It often carries with it very negative connotations, and people cringe when it's mentioned. But as a creation of God for marriage, and it's supposed to be a beautiful thing. That's why when Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, they were naked and not ashamed. It was when they had betrayed God's trust, betrayed one another, at least in their minds, that became something that caused problems, and they were ashamed. This describes the individual who is so obsessed with sexual immorality that they're trying to find new ways to be immoral, that they're seeking ways to extend their bounds of immorality. These are the people who the law is for. Men who practice homosexuality. Now it's interesting how specific Paul is here, because it doesn't just list a homosexual, someone who is engaging in sexuality with the same gender. It describes a man. And this word is used for those most often. And I don't want to get anywhere graphic, but I want us to understand the full extent of what Paul's trying to say here. Someone who is a man that is looking for a younger boy. They had a specific word for this. It was something that was seen as extremely shameful. The reason it's important for us to understand the full extent of these words is because Timothy did. The people that Paul wrote this letter to knew exactly what he meant. And when Paul goes on, laying on more and more of why this law is there, they understood the full gravity of it. These individuals are why the law's there. He goes on, enslavers. This isn't just someone who owns a slave. This is particularly describing the person that goes out, captures people, and then sells them for slavery. Someone who might meet this description is Joseph's brothers. Threw him in a pit and sold him into slavery. That's kind of the same description as what's going on here. Slavers. Now here's one that hits a little closer to home to all of us, I imagine. Liars. He's just been talking about murderers. People that murder their mothers, murder their fathers. Sodomites. And then he lists liars right along with them, showing the weight and gravity of the sin. Perjurers. Now what's interesting here is that this is basically the same thing as a liar, but this is someone who's lying under oath. Specifically, they give a false witness. When they're called to testify something, they make a practice of saying the wrong thing, possibly for money, possibly just to cause other harms. They're a person who you cannot trust because the witness account that they give is usually false. And then, as if he didn't cover enough already, he lays another blanket statement on all these. And whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. Now this specifically is pointing back to the law. To that sound teaching of the law. Because remember, all this he's been mentioning that the law is good. He isn't specifically talking here about the sound doctrine of Christianity that Paul had been teaching. He's talking about the sound doctrine of the law. The law is good if one uses it lawfully. But the law was not made for those that use it lawfully. It was made for those that trespass the law. And then he gives this long list. But he connects it. It's not just about the law. He says, in accordance with, right alongside, what accords with sound doctrine and what the law teaches, right alongside with the glorious gospel of the blessed God with which I have been entrusted. Now that's interesting because here he talks about these moral side of the law of Moses. These things that have always been wrong. Before the law of Moses was even given. He said the things that were listed by the law here, that long list we just went over, along with and alongside the things that are contrary to the very gospel that he was entrusted with. Now that word entrust comes from the word faith. God had faith in Paul and entrusted this to him. In faith gave this to him to spread out. Can we see the gravity of this when we look at these individual words and how much more there seems to be there? Paul is warning Timothy that people are going to come and they're going to be perverting this very gospel they preached. That they're going to be swerving from this moral compass, which is the ultimate goal, the aim of the charge. They're going to be swerving from the sincere faith. They're going to be swerving from the love. It's coming from the heart, a pure heart. They're going to be swerving from all this. And he's trying to encourage Timothy to charge them. This is what the law is for. This is why we have the law. He then closes up with that last section we read, verses 18 down through 20. Showing him that he needs to be waging warfare. When Marty spoke a couple of weeks back, one of his points was that we are at war. And I brought that up a couple of times because I want us to really understand this. We are at war. Timothy was at war. And Paul charged Timothy to serve as a soldier in an advantageous expedition. One that would give advantage. Not to just go out fighting for the sake of fighting, but to look for ways for there to be a positive impact. And it's interesting that the specific word he uses for this warfare is an expedition. He wasn't talking about dealing inside your borders. He describes when a nation goes outside of its borders to conquer. That's what Paul is charging Timothy to do. He's charging him to wage the good warfare. Wage an advantageous warfare. One that's going to make progress and matter. That's it. In strict contrast to this vain discussion that these other individuals would do. Here you have this vain discussion that is coming out of these genealogies. He says, beware these people that are wandering off into myths. Beware these people who have this vain, pointless discussion. And then he charges Timothy not to have a pointless warfare. To have an expedition that's good. To have an expedition that gives advantage to individuals. That progresses Christianity. And then he gives a warning. He needs to hold faith in a good conscience, that good moral compass. He needs to hold on to those because there are some people who have made shipwreck of their faith. You want to avoid faith shipwreck? Hold on to a good moral compass, hold on to a good conscience, and hold on to a sincere faith. That's where you will find that love that's issuing from a pure heart. But hold on to that. Paul uses the same word, or Luke uses it to describe the shipwreck that Paul would find. It's the same thing. It's a literal shipwreck. When a ship runs aground and is destroyed, it's no longer able to sail. It's stuck by the very things that we've been reading about. And lastly, what was the aim of this whole charge? The aim of this whole charge was not just to prevent others from falling into the same path. But why did Paul deliver Hymenaeus and Alexander over to Satan? Why did he hand them over to him? That they might learn not to blaspheme. He wasn't punishing them because he wanted to punish them. Vengeance is God's. He will repay. That's what Paul said in Romans. There's going to be a punishment one day for those that break this law, those that are not acting righteous before God. But he was trying to save their soul. He listed another way as that, I believe, in the Thessalonian letter. The point of the charge has always been to get people relocated where they need to be. I have a question that I want to leave us all with this evening. You have a choice, and the choice is left up to you and you alone. Would you like to be waging an advantageous warfare, something that's going to matter, something that is fruitful and productive warfare, conquering for Christ? Or you can choose a faith shipwreck. You can choose to devote yourself to myths and endless genealogies that lead others astray as well, that are very unproductive. What would you choose this evening? This evening, if you're sitting here and you would like to start conquering for God, if you would like to join His army, the work's already been done for you. Jesus came and He died, God in the flesh, so that He could provide a way around our faults and mistakes, so that He could take a sinner and make him into a saint, so that He could wash us clean by His very blood. All we have to do is die, be buried in water, and rise to walk a new life. If you've already done that, and you think maybe your faith might have already suffered a shipwreck, you can come back. You can come back and be restored. We want to offer you that opportunity as well. If you'd like to take part in that invitation, won't you come right now as we stand and sing together?